In 1997, something happened in St. Paul, Minnesota that should have been impossible. A brewery that had been making beer on the same piece of land for 132 years just stopped. No massive farewell, no national headlines, no final celebration. The doors simply closed. But here's the strange part. The beer didn't die. The name didn't die. The famous bear didn't completely disappear. What disappeared was the one thing Hamm's had spent more than a century convincing America was the soul of its beer: Minnesota itself. Because Hamm's wasn't just selling beer. It was selling Minnesota's lakes, Minnesota's forests, and most importantly, Minnesota's water. So how does a beer brand that built around one very specific place end up being owned by a company that no longer makes the beer there? To understand that, we have to go back to 1865. The accidental brewer. Theodore Hamm didn't set out to build a beer empire. In fact, he wasn't even a brewer. He had originally worked as a butcher in Germany before moving to America. Eventually, he settled in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he ran a saloon and boarding house. Then, almost by accident, everything changed. A brewer named Andrew Keller had built a small brewery over a deep artesian well in an area called Swede Hollow. The well mattered. Its water naturally passed through layers of Minnesota sandstone, producing cold, clean water without the kind of treatment modern breweries rely on. Keller needed money. Theodore Hamm loaned it to him. But Keller couldn't keep the brewery profitable. He defaulted, and in 1865, Theodore Hamm ended up owning the brewery. That's it. There was no grand business plan, no revolutionary recipe, no billionaire founder. A debt simply came due, and a saloon keeper suddenly became a brewer. He renamed the operation Excelsior Brewery, and then something unexpected happened. It grew fast. 5 employees became dozens. Hundreds of barrels became thousands. By the 1880s, the brewery was producing around 40,000 barrels a year. The accidental brewer had built one of Minnesota's biggest breweries, and underneath the entire operation was the same artesian well. At the time, nobody knew that this water would eventually become the foundation of a national brand, but it would. Then, America tried to kill the beer industry. For decades, Hamm's remained a regional workingman's beer. Simple, affordable, and deeply connected to Minnesota. Then, in 1920, the United States banned legal alcohol production. Prohibition. Minnesota had dozens of breweries before the ban. Only a handful survived until it ended. Hamm's was one of them. The company couldn't legally sell its main products, so it adapted. Soft drinks, food products, anything that could keep the factory alive. And that decision turned out to be incredibly important. Because when Prohibition ended in 1933, Hamm's wasn't starting from scratch. Its brewery was still there, its workers were still there, its equipment was still there, and the company had survived while competitors disappeared. But Hamm's didn't stop at survival. It decided to expand. Instead of remaining a Minnesota brewery, it began acquiring breweries in other parts of America. And by the 1950s, Hamm's had climbed all the way to become the 5th largest brewery in the United States. But the biggest reason people across America knew the name wasn't the beer itself. It was the bear. The bear. That sold a feeling. In 1945, Hamm's hired an advertising agency with one mission: turn a Midwestern beer into a national brand. And the agency understood something important. Hamm's didn't have to convince America that its beer was the best beer. It had to convince America that drinking Hamm's meant entering a different world. So the commercials showed Minnesota: lakes, pine forests, moonlight, wilderness, and a phrase became inseparable from the brand: the land of sky blue waters. Then in 1952, an advertising creative reportedly sketched a bear on a napkin. That sketch eventually became the Hamm's bear. He was clumsy, cheerful, always getting himself into trouble in the North Woods, and somehow it worked. The bear became one of the most recognizable beer characters in America. By 1965, a national survey ranked the Hamm's bear as the best-liked advertisement in the country. Think about how crazy that is. A regional beer from Minnesota had created an advertisement people liked more than almost anything else on television. And Hamm's had discovered the secret. It wasn't selling beer. It was selling nostalgia before nostalgia was even a marketing strategy. The beer became a memory. Starting in 1961, Hamm's sponsored Minnesota Twins radio and television broadcasts. For thousands of families, the Hamm's jingle became part of baseball. The drum beat, the music, the announcer, then the game. For many people who grew up with it, that sound became inseparable from childhood. And this is where Hamm's became incredibly powerful, because you could forget what the beer tasted like, but you wouldn't necessarily forget the feeling. The lake, the bear, the baseball game, the glowing sign in the bar. Hams had built something competitors couldn't easily copy, a memory. And then the company started dismantling it, the mistake that changed everything. In 1965, exactly a century after Theodore Ham acquired the brewery, the Ham family sold the company. The business was now controlled by people far removed from the original brewery in St. Paul. Then, in 1969, management ended its advertising relationship with the agency responsible for the famous campaign. The bear disappeared. The new leadership wanted to focus on the brewing process instead. The bear was considered old-fashioned, but consumers didn't see him that way. To them, the bear wasn't just an advertisement. The bear was Ham's. The company eventually tried bringing the character back, but the original magic never fully returned. Then came another problem. Ownership kept changing. Ham's moved from one corporate owner to another, and every new owner had a slightly different idea of what the brand should be. The connection to St. Paul became weaker, and eventually something almost unthinkable happened. The brewery itself was traded away. The brewery that stopped making hams. In 1984, the original St. Paul Brewery, the place where Theodore Ham's story had begun, was traded to Stroh Brewing Company. Think about what that meant. The brewery had been built around the artesian well that helped define the brand. It had operated continuously since 1865. It was the physical foundation of the Ham's story, and now it belonged to someone else. Soon, Ham's production moved away from St. Paul. The building remained, but the beer didn't. The place that had created the brand's identity was no longer making the beer carrying its name. The slogan still talked about Minnesota, the advertising still evoked Minnesota, but the actual beer had been separated from the place, and that separation would eventually become permanent. By the 1990s, the American beer industry had changed. Large national breweries were becoming more powerful. Regional brands were struggling. Stroh was losing ground, and eventually the St. Paul Brewery's time ran out. In 1997, Stroh shut it down. Around 350 workers lost their jobs. The wells stopped, the equipment went silent, and after 132 years, the brewery that had begun with an accidental loan finally stopped making beer. The building was silent, but the Ham's name wasn't. 2 years later, in 1999, the Ham's trademark moved to Miller, and that created the ultimate irony. Miller owned the name, but it didn't own the place that gave the name its meaning. What? Actually survived. Ham still survives as a low-priced beer brand. The bear still appears from time to time, and longtime fans still proudly call themselves Hampians. But something important was lost. Not the recipe, not the trademark, not even the bear. The connection. Because the original Ham story wasn't really about a beer. It was about a place, a specific well, a specific valley, a specific brewery, a specific piece of Minnesota. But that's why collectors in St. Paul still preserve old Ham signs, mugs, advertisements, and memorabilia. Fans even helped create a granite statue of the Ham's bear. Because for them, Hams represent something a modern relaunch can't simply manufacture. A memory, a time when the beer actually came from the place it claimed to represent. And that's what makes the Ham story bigger than beer. A company can buy a trademark, it can buy a recipe, buy the advertising rights, but it can't buy the history that happened on the ground where the story began. Ham spent more than a century turning Minnesota into a brand. Then, over several decades, the company separated the brand from Minnesota itself. The name survived, the bear survived, the beer survived, but the brewery didn't. And maybe that's the most important lesson. A brand can own its name without owning its identity, because sometimes the most valuable thing a company owns isn't the product. It isn't the logo. It isn't the trademark. It's the place, the people, and the memories that made customers care about it in the first place. Ham's lost the place, but Minnesota kept the memory. And somewhere in St. Paul, an old Ham's bear sign can still flicker above a bar, reminding everyone of a beer that was once much more than a beer.